Good morning. My name is Ken Gibb. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about some work we're doing in CASH about rent controls. This work relates to an international evidence review that we were planning to do in our research, but due to external interest and the external kind of context, we decided to bring the project forward. So the research has been carried out by myself, Adriana Suita and Alex Marsh. And although it's not quite finished yet, it was apposite, given the conference, to try to say something about at least one aspect of the work, which is the econometric evidence that I looked at as part of the evidence review. So I'm really delighted to have the chance to give you an early sense of at least part of the findings of this work. So I'm just going to really talk a little bit about the reason why this relevancy has emerged in recent past, and talk a little bit about both the grey literature, which I looked at, and also the more direct econometric evidence, and say something about what I think this says in a broader sense. So why now? Well, from a parochial Scottish perspective, as I'm well known for, there's at least a couple of interesting reasons. We have, since the end of 2017, established something called local rent pressure zones, which was essentially a model used in the Republic of Ireland, which is aimed at localized control of rent increases, but actually it's turned out there's a very high hurdle to find the data and the evidence to introduce those caps on rent increases. And partly because of that, the Scottish Labour Party has launched a private members bill in Scotland to introduce something called fair rents, also known as the Mary Barber Bill, which is essentially a Scottish-wide cap on rent increases at inflation plus, say, 1%. There are some other provisions in the bill which is now being read in Parliament, and it's really the rent limitation I want to talk about, the second generation rent control I want to focus on. There's, with the fair wind, the bill has possibility of becoming legislation. So it's not a private members bill, which is just something the kind of whim of an individual that has quite a lot of backing behind it. At the same time, I've recently been on the Affordable Housing Commission, which reported a month or two ago, and one of its arguments is about the imbalance in the housing system, and particularly unaffordability in the rental market. And it also talks around the issue of some kind of limitation on rent increases. Clearly, one of the aspects of COVID has been worries about affordability, and even by protecting people from eviction and such like, obviously debates have come up about the fairness of rents, about inequalities, and about whether there's something that can be done. And of course, this really takes us to some of these absolutely classic long-term debates, to make it black and white between economists and people from the broader social policy community, and a mixture of course, ideology on both sides, I suspect, and also the way in which evidence is interpreted and used, and the analytical kind of arguments that underpin that. One of the reasons that we wanted, from an academic point of view, to take up the cudgels of the rent control debate at this time was because there is some evidence in different ways to suggest that the monolith of economic thinking about interventions in markets, particularly the private rented sector, may be unfreezing and shifting just a little bit. So it's well known, I think, that going back over 20 years, Richard Arnott made this distinction between first generation and second generation rent controls, and started to argue, or started to make a case, that some of these second generation rent limitation type things were maybe not quite as damaging and maybe protected some of the more vulnerable, and didn't do that much harm if they were properly designed. And at the same time, in recent years, there's been interesting debates in analogous areas like the economics of the minimum wage, which suggests that if you look more carefully at the economic structure of particular markets like the labour market, you might find that once we empirically move away from the notion of a perfectly competitive market, then some of the presumptions about the welfare consequences of introducing interventions do not follow. And for at least 20 years, some economists, I would highlight Bengt Turner and Steve Malpezzi in the case of rent controls, some economists have been arguing actually that similar arguments might apply to rent controls. In other words, if we can't say with confidence that the market works as a competitive outcome, we cannot necessarily reach some of the tried and tested conclusions that the conventional rent control legislation or literature, arrives at. So that's kind of what I'm interested to explore, and I'll come back to that at the end. So, as I said, I started looking at some grey literature, and this is some of that. Michael Bald's report, which was fairly critical of rent limitations or second generation rent controls in the context of tenure security being introduced at the same time. Of course, that tenure security doesn't exist anymore in most of the UK, though arguably the security of tenancies is much stronger now in Scotland. Looked at some work by Scanlon and Whitehead, an interesting paper from Cambridge Centre for Housing and Planning Research, Clark et al., which tries to model and simulate different kinds of rent control impacts, which did a major piece of work about rent regulation and about regulation of the rental market, more broadly. And what's interesting about it is that they thought really long and hard about the way that which regulations interact, but actually they say very little about rent controls themselves. Whitehead and Williams have done 2 reports for the RLA, which are interesting because they're fairly nuanced and balanced pieces of work which look at international evidence and consider the case in a fairly neutral, detached and balanced kind of way for a more permissive system which would allow some degree of second generation rent limitation type policies. Robertson and Young for Shelter Scotland is a report which is concerned with the problems of introducing rent pressure zones and draws on some international evidence to make that case. And finally, Clay and Smith, also for the RLA, is kind of outlier in all of these. It kind of takes us back to Michael Ball's position. A very strongly argued analysis from a conventional textbook microeconomics perspective, drawing on some international evidence, pretty reliant on 1 or 2 academic sources, one of which I'll talk about in a minute, but really rather unreconstructed in many respects. So it's always difficult when you're doing these critical evidence reviews to use the grey literature, but I think the fact that much of what we're looking at is actually academically focused has clearly had different degrees of peer review and actually synthesizes a lot of literature. I think it would be inefficient from a kind of information point of view or perspective not to look at these, but clearly the guts of the academic evidence review is to look at a peer-reviewed journal set of journal papers, and that's what we do. So let's move on to that. First of all, we rather arbitrarily took a cut-off point at the year 2000, and that was mainly because I think people like Turner and Malpezzi in 2003 had done such an excellent job of overviewing the literature up to around 2000. But also it's a nice neat number, and it means we have 20 years of evidence to look at. So my analysis is really looking at econometric studies of rent controls from different markets and looking at what work's been done, how the work has become more or less sophisticated in drawing on new economic ideas, but in particular new ways of modelling particular dimensions of the effects of regulation. So can split this into two components. There are a series of meta reviews that we start with. One is Jenkins' paper in 2009, which is a rather generous and uncritical assessment of a large number of essentially North American studies of rent controls, which takes a fairly conventional and uncritical perspective on them. But it's a very broad-ranging, large review of papers, and not without some merit. But as I say, it's kind of orthodox and unchallenging in some respects. Turner and Malpezzi is simply, I think, the best paper that's been written in this field. It's a large, broad, thoughtful, critical paper, which, while broadly sympathetic with some of the sharper and better argued conventional papers, does raise some challenging questions, which I'll return to as we go along. Then alongside that, secondly, we've kind of broken down the analysis into 4 or 5 parts, looked at analysis of economic welfare. So people like Ed Glaser have done important work trying to understand the conventional welfare implications of rent controls, distinguishing between those people with rent controls and those without, arguing that once rent controls are imposed, for instance, that has impacts on the allocation of housing, and that people don't necessarily, as markets are supposed to do, would take the highest value housing. There are papers that look at the longer term, try to measure the impact of rent controls in that way, think about how they impact on the supply of housing. There's an increasing body of work which tries to distinguish between the imposition of rent control, the re-imposition of rent control where in the recent past there hadn't been, and also decontrol, including vacancy decontrol. That is the classic second generation rent limitation model, where when a tenancy is ended, the new tenant will face a new market rent, but thereafter there will be limitations on rent increases. So vacancy decontrol tries to capture that effect. Also, lots of work's been done on spillovers, particularly between controlled markets and adjacent uncontrolled markets. And that's become a kind of almost like a necessary part of serious econometric research on rent controls. There's also been work done on mobility and employment effects as people respond to the impacts of facing lower rents than the market would bear. So a couple of things to say, I suppose, about the work that we've looked at this stage. There's a predominance in North American studies. We see an awful lot of work done on New York and 1 or 2 other places, particularly Massachusetts. There's a tension, I think, between increasingly sophisticated and clever econometric tests and ever stronger assumptions being made in the economics themselves. As I said a minute ago, there's been a real growth in particular of thinking about and trying to capture the misallocation of individual welfare, impacts in neighbouring areas, and a series of wider impacts such as in the labour market. But all of these need to be understood in the market and institutional context. So what are my fundamental provisional conclusions at this stage, having looked at 30 or 40 papers? I think there clearly is only one game in town in terms of possible developments for housing systems which don't have controls, and that are some form of second generation controls, rent limitation controls, perhaps tied to non-rent regulatory powers. And I think the best studies try to capture the interaction between second generation models, local market context, and the regulatory structure that impinges on the rental market beyond what the rent controls are. But I'll go back to Turner and Malpezzi and say that they explicitly suggested that a better way through an analysis of specific rent control outcomes should explicitly try to understand the context that the rental market operates in, its institutional context, its market context, the way in which regulations and rents interact, but particularly this sense of just how competitive is the market. So they raised a question, why don't we have an index or some metric or multiple metrics which allow us to say this rental market can be fairly assumed to equate to something that looks like a competitive market, or in this case is much more imperfectly competitive, or in this case it's much more oligopolistic. And by doing that, we can then fairly, I think about different kinds of models, approaches, methodologies, applied economics that would be better suited for trying to understand the consequences of constraining rents in those different setups. So the big kind of research conclusion for me is that I think post this project and putting together the theoretical, the social policy, the econometric kind of reviews, and thinking about the implications for current policy, practice, and legislative debate, I think the big conclusion for us is that we'd like to move on and do further research where we'd actually try to generate some kind of practical version of what that market structure index might look like in order to help housing planners and local housing system policy developers, if such a thing exists, help them think about in an empirical way just what kinds of evidence about the level of competition and hence the efficacy of different forms of intervention would actually be. So I hope you found some of that interesting. As I say, I hope the research will be out relatively shortly, but I'm just going to stop at that point, I think, if I can work out how to turn myself off. Just bear with me.